Elon Musk unmatched. Why no billionaire can surpass his game-changing impact. The journey from unknown to unbeatable immortal monument in the billionaire world. The night of that landing looked like a wager placed against gravity itself. The sea was a sheet of ink. The drone ship, a steel punctuation floating in the dark, waited under a sky full of satellites like faintly smudged chalk. Engines flared, a pillar of fire steadied, and the rocket that had moments before clawed at the stratosphere now reversed destiny and came home on its tail, a cathedral spire kneeling precisely on a barge the size of a city block. Somewhere far from the salt spray and telemetry chatter, 1,000 boardrooms and government bureaus inhaled the same thin breath. The old rule in spaceflight used once, throwaway had not been debated in a committee or pleaded with in a white paper. It had been overruled, physically, live, in front of anyone who cared to watch. The camera panned across a sooty fuselage. The chant from the control room leaked through our speakers. And in that scene, precision landing, public proof, audacity made routine, resided the simplest explanation for why any fair comparison between Elon Musk and the rest of the world's billionaires will always be lopsided. They optimize the game, he rewrites the rulebook, and then forces the league to play by it. Comparisons usually begin with net worth and end with the same tired dance of digits. But fortunes rise and fall like tides, and tides are set by a moon you cannot touch. To compare Musk to Arnault, to Buffett, to Gates, to Bezos, to Zuckerberg, to Ellison by money alone, is to rank volcanoes by the number of tourists who bought postcards last season. If you really want to know who stands higher, you must step back far enough to see which mountains moved. On one side stand empires of brand, finance, retail, software, and social attention astonishing edifices, each fixed upon a terrain that existed before their architects built upon it. On the other side stands a moving frontier whose terrain is remade as it advances rocketry that changes the arithmetic of orbit, electric drivetrains that flip the default of personal transport, satellite constellations that pour bandwidth into the deserts of connectivity, factories that look less like facilities and more like programmable instruments. The former is mastery. The latter is gravity rewritten in installments. Place Musk beside Bernard Arnault, patron of the exquisite and scarce. Luxury is an empire of story, the aura of the atelier, the patina of heritage, the scarcity that makes time itself feel like it has been woven into the leather. The world is better for it. Culture needs its icons, but culture also needs its pipes. Musk's kingdom is a network of unglamorous arteries that carry electrons and packets and thrust through the body of the modern world. The bag changes the gaze, the battery and the booster change the baseline. A luxury house can tell you who you are. A rocket that lands itself changes what your species can do next Tuesday. Set him next to Warren Buffett, the high priest of reason applied to money. Many have tried to emulate Buffett's discipline, and few have survived the first cycle. That is how deep and rare his patience island. But even the Oracle of Omaha is playing with the grain of the world as it exists, pricing risk, allocating capital, compounding advantage in enterprises that are fundamentally terrestrial. Musk turns his chair 90 degrees and asks whether the grain itself can be tilted. Finance refines the current. Factories and flight hardware distort the riverbed. That is not a moral superiority. It is a mechanical one. A new riverbed forces every boat to find a different path. Put him against Bill Gates, the emperor of the desktop age, who standardized an interface for thought and work and then stepped aside to fight microscopic wars on humanity's behalf. Gates made software predictable when it mattered most. Musk makes hardware iterative when the textbook said that was impossible. Gates gave you menus and APIs. Musk gives you castings the size of studio apartments, cells that behave like a regimented army, and engines whose turbopumps look like metal tornadoes tamed by mathematics. Software can crash and reboot. Metals remember heat. When you push on matter, it pushes back without sentiment. To make that world move fast is to teach gravity a new tempo. Line him up beside Jeff Bezos, a builder of continents within the internet, an architect of logistics at planetary scale, a quiet general who turned warehouse rhythms into a civilization's heartbeat. Bezos took friction out of commerce until buying something felt like a thought that became a box on your porch. His cloud rented computation as if it were electricity. In this mirror, Musk is almost a different species. Not a warehouse mind, but a foundry mind. Bezos reduces weighting. Musk reduces the weight of impossible. The former trained millions to expect the arrival of goods. The latter trains an entire industry to expect the return of rockets. And if you insist on drawing the spaceflight parallel, then the divergence becomes almost theological. Blue Origin's cathedral is carved in caution, beautiful and methodical. SpaceX's cathedral is assembled in public, a scaffolding permanently hung with new experiments, a liturgy of test-fail-fix repeated until the hymn is muscle memory. Both are trying to reach the same heaven. One argues that heaven will come when the text is perfect. The other throws prototype after prototype skyward and annotates with fire. Stand him beside Mark Zuckerberg, the cartographer of the human gaze. Attention is a continent, and Meta was one of the first to draw borders on it that held there is craft and there is danger in reshaping how billions of eyes move and where their minutes go. But eyes move in the head, and the head remains on Earth. Musk bets on the geometry that relocates the head itself. He cares about entropy rather than engagement, energy density rather than daily active users, terminal velocity rather than time spent. He measures with the ruler of inertia. His cohort is not cohorts. It is quanta. There is a bridge between those worlds, because all worlds need bridges, but the load-bearing members are not the same. A social feed reorders the texture of your day. A planetary EV fleet reorders the texture of your grid. A Leo constellation reorders the texture of your planet's nervous system. And then there is Larry Ellison, a baron of the database, a steward of the backbone of record-keeping without which enterprise would dissolve into rumor. Ellison's legacy is the discipline that keeps the world's ledgers aligned. Musk's is the discipline that keeps a 30-story tube of propellant from becoming a fireworks show. Control points in software defend themselves by syntax and permissions. Control points in physics defend themselves by combustion, stability, and phase change. Both are unforgiving. One refuses to parse. The other explodes. All these men, Arnault, Buffett, Gates, Bezos, Zuckerberg, Ellison, stand on summits they carve themselves from long mountain ranges. Each, in his own way, is an argument about how to exert power. Through taste, through allocation, through standardization, through logistics, through attention, through data. Musk's argument is blunt to the point of violence. Change the denominator. Alter the constant. Put the handrail of civilization on a different wall. The difference is not merely what he builds, but how he builds it. He's a CEO who says, why does this part still require 3 turns on the thread? Not as theater, but because he has stood where the torque wrench sings. He is a founder who will sleep on the factory couch, not to be photographed doing so, but because the line stutters less when the decision maker is a few seconds closer to the stutter. He stares at yield charts the way a surgeon stares at a heart monitor, not as a dashboard, but as a living patient. When the phrase "skin in the game" is uttered by most, it means equity. When it is uttered around Musk, it includes exhaustion. Even his critics, who are legion and loud and often correct about his impulsiveness, his online provocations, his taste for brinkmanship, become unwitting characters in the engine he understands. Attention is pressurized oxygen. Outrage is a pump. If the combustion chamber can hold, the heat becomes thrust. Musk's trick is that he builds the chamber in public. He lets the cameras linger on failure and then asks the cameras to come back next week. That spectacle does something corrosive to the confidence of his competitors. It shifts their risk calculus. They get to decide whether to fail in private very slowly or fail in public very quickly. He leaves them praying for a third option that never appears. This is why the unit of account in Musk's world is not dollars but deltas. Before Tesla, the average person could not have convincingly expected a future in which the baseline car in a driveway was electrified with a software nervous system that learned your routes like an animal learns its territory. Before SpaceX, no adult could have argued with a straight face that rockets might land daily like aircraft and be turned around with crews that look like mechanics rather than monks. Before Starlink, entire geographies had quietly accepted their banishment from the global conversation. Each time, the counterfactual is so close you can still smell it. And each time, after the pivot, the counterfactual looks medieval. Musk's unfair advantage is not that he is richer, he often wasn't, nor that his smarter intelligence grows on trees in the circles he works in, but that he refuses to let the boundary between vision and operations calcify. Many CEOs talk first principles in keynotes. He uses first principles as a wrench. Many executives say move fast and then announce that the design has been frozen. He insists the design remains alive until the last unit, the last hour before the line must stamp. Many leaders demand innovation from their org chart. He removes degrees of freedom from the org chart to force innovation out of the metal. He will carve weight out of an assembly with a fanatic's joy, remove a wiring harness like a sculptor shaving marble, consolidate parts until a bill of materials looks like a diet plan. He will insist on in-house vertical integration to a degree that sounds medieval to MBA ears, not because he hates suppliers, but because he loves learning velocity. Speed of iteration is the only currency that purchases the right to argue with physics. The gigapress is not a machine. It is a thesis that thinks in castings. The 4,680 cell is not a component. It is a sentence that wants to become a paragraph and then a chapter. More energy density here becomes more range, there becomes more options elsewhere. The methane engine is not a propulsive choice. It is a commitment to refueling at destinations we do not yet inhabit. Critics will say that all this rhetoric can be aimed at anyone who builds anything, that the romance of the factory floor has been used to cover sins. They are right to be suspicious of romance. Romance has bankrupted many. But romance alone does not pour 4 million cars onto roads that used to dismiss the category. Nor does it deliver dozens upon dozens of landings, nor does it drop terminals into prairies and war zones and fishing villages and ask the sky to carry speech. The romance must sign receipts. In Musk's world, receipts look like soot and aluminum swarf, like paint on forearms at 312A, like the geometry of a manifold rewritten, because a junior engineer dares sketch something that offended the previous version with its obviousness. To say no one can surpass him in the billionaire pantheon is not to say that no one can eclipse his bank account or that no one will build something more beloved or more ubiquitous. It is to say that on the axis that matters most, the ability to push the world's baseline forward in multiple domains, where baseline was previously thought immovable. He has combined the rarest vectors in one frame, an engineer's contempt for superstition, a capital allocator's courage under dilution, a showman's patience for attention's volatility, a recruiter's magnetism for people who crave big problems, and a masochist's tolerance for public failure. Others possess one or two of these traits and are celebrated for it. He presses all of them into one body and dares that body to survive. You can see it in the math of his choices when the calendar went thin and the cash went thinner. Any consultant would have told him to pick one, the car or the rocket. He refused. He funded both at levels that made the spreadsheets blush. Stupidity, said the spreadsheets. Inevitability, said the outcomes. He knew something about flywheels before they were metaphors. The rocket company would one day need a private customer with a constant appetite for launches. The satellite network would be happy to oblige. The satellite network would one day need cheaper boosters. The rocket company would deliver. The car company would one day need batteries that could light a city. The battery teams forged on. The robot atop the car becomes a data generator that trains a brain that the robot on two legs might one day borrow. Unrelated bets is a phrase for analysts who cannot see the hinge. Yes, he is polarizing. So polarizing that writers like me feel the need to declare it as an act of prophylaxis before the comments arrive. Yes, he is online, too online, at hours that suggest a circadian rhythm held together by espresso and adrenaline. Yes, he sometimes speaks like a man who thinks out loud and enjoys learning in public, even when the cost is reputational. But the legacy of most industrialists is not decided by their quips. It is decided by whether their factories outlast their biographies. If Tesla's lines keep moving when Musk sleeps, then he has not built a cult, but a system. If SpaceX's cadence keeps tightening whether or not he tweets, then he has taught a doctrine, not just imposed a mood. If the network hums over places whose names he will never learn to pronounce, then he has made himself irrelevant in the purest, most honorable way an engineer can be. by building something that no longer requires him. The secret door that separates him from the rest is not a private jet, but a private willingness to take the hit. He will let you see the mist. He will mount the mist on a wall and call it a souvenir. He will mine the mist for mathematics and then put the mathematics on the next vehicle as if a scar were a credential. He will frighten his lawyers and teach his interns. He will demand capacity from steel as if it were a colleague late on a deadline. He will speak of Mars with a boy's unembarrassed appetite and then drive the procurement schedule like a quartermaster of a hungry army. He is cliché and he is clinical, sometimes in the same afternoon. He is a headline and he is a footnote on the drawing. The noise and the noise about the noise are part of the same current, but they are not the current itself. The current is a crude graph drawn on a whiteboard that shows how many seconds can be shaved if only 3 bolts become 1. How many dollars disappear from the cost curve when you turn 9 processes into 2. It is fashionable to insist that all great men are simply the beneficiaries of ties larger than themselves. The supply chain makes the CEO, history picks its instruments, the individual is only the story we tell to make the spreadsheet human. There is truth in that humility, but there are also moments when the individual's appetite for iteration pulls the tide. And then the tide carries everyone else, competitors, regulators, suppliers, journalists, toward a harbor they did not plan to visit. That is what it looks like when Musk works at full setting. He paints the target and then moves it at a speed that embarrasses the archer. He would rather apologize for a missed date than apologize for a smaller ambition. He will be late to the party he throws and still make the party the only one worth attending. So if you insist on a ranking, here is one that won't require annual recalculation. Who has forced the rest to copy their homework in the hardest classes? Ask the car makers whose bonus plans now include electrification milestones they mocked 5 years ago. Ask the space agencies that must explain to their parliaments why their rockets are still disposable. Ask the telecoms that must explain to remote schools why the ground has no fiber but the sky now does. Ask the militaries that now treat low Earth orbit like a chessboard where the pawns move as if they were queens. These are not the ripples of a brand campaign or a product refresh. These are plate shifts. And plate shifts define eras. Look long enough, and you will see that his lecture to the world is not delivered from a podium, but engraved into process. He does not argue with you that something can be done. He schedules the attempt and invites you to watch. He does not ask for unanimous consent. He asks for thrust to weight. He is allergic to ceremonies that do not connect to torque. When he smiles, it is usually because a line is meeting a throughput target that seemed unreasonable 6 weeks ago. When he laughs, it is often because a test that should have exploded did not. His jokes are not necessarily good. His prototypes sometimes are. He perseverates. He yanks. He repeats himself. He is patient with complexity and impatient with the parts of bureaucracy that exist to defend complexity. He will overcorrect and then correct the overcorrection. He will be wrong loudly and right even louder. If you're looking for the single clause that explains why surpassing him is improbable, it is this: in order to surpass him on the frontier that matters, you would have to be willing to combine an engineer's intimacy with materials, a financier's risk tolerance for correlated bets, a communicator's indifference to mockery, and a recruiter's ability to concentrate A players into a room where politics die of oxygen deprivation. You would have to enter domains where the opponent is friction, dwell time, thermal runaway, burn rate, capacitance, regulatory latency, opponents that can be charmed by neither marketing nor moralizing. You would have to abide years in which the scoreboard calls you a fool and the cameras catch you admitting as much, and then you would have to convert the fool's reputation into the fool's advantage, the license to try even stranger things, because no one expects you to win anyway. There's a version of the future in which Elon Musk becomes a cautionary tale told by those who never liked him. Hubris, overreach, the inevitable stumble of the too ambitious. There is a version in which he is simply folded into the pantheon, one more face on the Mount Rushmore of capital and will. And then there is the version you can feel every time a booster steps off the sky and onto a deck. Every time a substation groans under demand that once would have belonged to gasoline, Every time a terminal wakes like a silver mushroom on a farmhouse roof and says hello to the cloud, the version in which he becomes ordinary because his standards have become ordinary. In that version, surpassing him would require moving the baseline again in more than one field at once, faster than institutions can frown. It is not impossible. It is simply rare. And rarity is what monuments are made of. He is not perfect. He is not polite to error. He is not even consistent with himself across the years. He changes his mind when the data shames his previous self. He keeps records not like a librarian but like a forensic accountant of failure. He keeps enemies the way a blacksmith keeps sparks. He makes promises like a gambler and then drafts engineers into the table. He is accused of being a promoter. Good. It is useful to be promoted to the frontier if you intend to fight there. He is accused of being a tyrant. Fine. Gravity is a tyrant first. He is accused of being lucky. Of course, you cannot call down that much lightning without some of it striking you in the right place at the right time. But luck is not a strategy. It is a seasoning. The recipe is iteration. And that is why, when the museum of this era is built from server racks and alloy frames and anachronistic smartphones, and the curators try to explain to children what it felt like to watch the future arrive out of order, they will point to a handful of artifacts. A scorched booster with a stencil name, a die-cast block the size of a small car body, a floor tile from a factory installed not as decoration but as a sample of a process, a dish that looks like it came from a minimalist kitchen and in fact fed a village with bandwidth. They will say this is what it looks like when someone refuses to be measured by money alone and insists on being measured by the displacement of the horizon. They will say this is how the rules were changed and enforced by performance. They will say this is how one man's appetite enlisted thousands of other appetites until the meal cooked itself. The others will still matter. Arnault will still make beauty speak softly. Buffett will still prove that quiet compounding can win wars others never notice. Gates will still remind us that code organizes both work and mercy. Bezos will still deliver the world to your door and lease you the sky's computation. Zuckerberg will still show you that your attention is a city with more districts than you imagined. Ellison will still insist that your memory be consistent and your records reconcile. But Musk, for better and worse, will still be the one who looked at the plate tectonics of industry and said, push here, here, and here, and the continent will slide under your feet. He did not sell the new world. He built the dock. He brought the ship home on his tail. The morning after the landing, the video had already begun its pilgrimage across boardrooms, ministries, dorms, and kitchens. There was a peculiar silence in the way people watched it. Even the most talkative paused at the moment the legs deployed, as if afraid that sound itself might jostle the rocket off balance. That silence is where empires are born. Not in cheering, but in the suspension of disbelief that allows a new default to seep into the collective mind. It is the same hush that follows a sudden realization in a lab. The equation balances, the instrument hums, the model holds. You do not celebrate. You stare. You let the new normal rewire the room. If you want to know why Musk outruns his peer set, begin with his relationship to normal. For most titans of industry, normal is a resource to optimize. For him, normal is a cage to escape. He approaches the status quo like an engineer approaches a binding constraint. Not with hatred, but with an almost erotic curiosity. How tightly does this shackle hold? What geometry is at work? Where is the seam? What if we heat it, cool it, bend it? What breaks first? He will pace a factory aisle like a courtroom, argue with a part as if it were a witness withholding the truth. If that sounds like theater, it is because the stakes are theatrical. A production line is a civilization compressed into meters. A single conveyor whispers the whole story of a firm. What it believes, what it neglects, where it hides its fear, how honest it is about time. It took an honesty bordering on cruelty to stare at the Model 3 production hell and decide that the correct response to a line choking on complexity was not to blame the workers or the vendors, but to confess that the car itself had been designed with too many tastes in its mouth. Musk's answer was not a memo about morale. It was a scalpel. Fewer parts, larger castings, a philosophical war on connectors and brackets, that had accreted like barnacles over a hull. He was a minimalist, not out of aesthetic purity, but out of hatred for friction. Yet the aesthetic emerges anyway. The simplest machine is the one that looks as if it were inevitable. There are CEOs who would have pivoted to software metaphors to justify a hardware slowdown. He pivoted to hardware metaphors to justify a software acceleration. The factory is the product was not a slogan. It was a diagnosis. If the factory is a product, then the car is the exhaust. We measure success not by the brochure-ready curve of a fender, but by the throughput of a cell line, by the absence of wait stays between stations, by the number of seconds shaved from a lift, by the percentage of steps that got eaten by a giant die-cast machine that does in one thump what a chorus of robots used to do in a nervous hour. That is not contempt for beauty. It is the recognition that, at scale, beauty is statistical. This is where the comparison to the rest of the billionaire class becomes almost unfair. Bernard Arnault can command ateliers and curators and brand historians to create an aura, but he cannot order the periodic table to yield an alloy that chills faster without cracking. Warren Buffett can teach patience to a culture that fetishizes immediacy, but he cannot coax a cast to feel a thin rib without turbulence. Bill Gates can evangelize structured thinking to a society that confuses preference with principle, but he cannot tell a battery to take another 10% without paying for it in heat. Jeff Bezos can make time an obedient animal from click to doorstep, but he cannot change the coefficient of friction between two surfaces in sliding contact. Mark Zuckerberg can manipulate the bloodstream of attention, but he cannot ask a turbopump to forgive a tolerance stack. Larry Ellison can demand integrity from Oracle schema until the world's records reconcile, but he cannot ask a methane flame to stabilize if the mixture is wrong. Musk lives at the junction where human intention negotiates with physics. His wins are notarized by materials. You could watch the narrative of the electric vehicle revolution unfold as if it were a morality play about incumbents mocked into progress. But inside the plants, the plot was more granular. The shape of a casting changed. A cooling channel rerouted. A jig eliminated. A seam moved. A supplier humiliated then redeemed. A scrap rate cut. A torque spec tightened. A lid finally closed without complaint. The grandstanding about range and autonomy and affordability was theater for retail investors and rivals. The real drama was whether the factory could be made to metabolize the design without indigestion. Musk's biggest trick was to make glamorous the most unglamorous work imaginable: cycle time. In the years when skeptics chuckled about sedans and vanity projects, the Tesla teams learned to treat complexity like an enemy with a name. You never defeat it. You only keep it from reproducing. The moment a subsystem proliferates options, the moment a harness grows an extra connector to solve a local inconvenience, the moment a part sprouts a flange that makes a downstream tolerance easier, you are backsliding. Musk's severity, the online bravado that critics enjoy cataloging, has a quieter twin. A monkish contempt for the ways organizations comfort themselves with micro-concessions that grow into macro-entropy. He doesn't hate committees because committees are slow. He hates them because committees bargain with entropy and think they've negotiated a peace. And yet the factory work was only half the frontier. The other half scorched the sky. When Blue Origin preached perfection and government programs insisted on meeting minutes, SpaceX published a different catechism. Fast, instrumented failure is not the opposite of safety. It is a route to it. Audiences learn the acronyms and the Victorian etiquette of launch windows. They learn to recognize the sound of a good start and the cough of an unstable burn. They learn that a booster that rapidly unscheduled its disassembly was not a tombstone but a chapter marker. Musk demystified rocketry not by simplifying it but by televising its wounds. The audacity was not in landing. The audacity was in building a culture that could watch itself miss on Monday and go back to the pad on Wednesday as if humiliation were a vitamin. This was a language the other billionaires did not or could not speak. They use laboratories too, they iterate too, but they seldom let the world see their naked experiments. Musk made apprenticeship global. He made spectators into students. And as the world watched, regulators and competitors and allies discovered that their instincts had softened in the absence of public stakes. A culture that argues every memo in private for a year will be beaten by a culture that does 6 public versions inside that year and makes the 7th the one that passes inspection. Musk imported the open source rhythm release early, released often into a domain that had been closed by tradition. He stole speed from software and fed it to metal. When Starlink woke up on rooftops, all those years of embarrassment converted into dividends. A field hospital that would have begged a telecom for a mercy install found itself pointing a dish at a sky already crowded with routers that never need sleep. A fisherman with weather hands and no interest in web drama found that the catch could be tracked, the market watched, the price negotiated without stepping off the boat. Children in the dark found the classroom hiding in the air. The constellation is not romantic. It is infrastructure. It is the sort of thing nations use to build and then underfund. Musk did not invent the idea. He invented the cadence. The rivals are not slow because they are lazy. They are slow because when the stack is that tall, satellite, terminal, ground station, launch, replenishment, you cannot rent enough pieces to simulate integration. You either own the stack's brain or you drown in handoffs. This is where vertical integration stops sounding like a seminar and starts sounding like predestination. You could object that all this is just a hymn to one man's mythology. You would be right to object, and you will still miss the point. The mythology has been metabolized by thousands of people who are not Musk. Their names are on shift schedules, not magazine covers. The proof that Musk is not merely a cult of personality is simple. The work continues when he is elsewhere, and elsewhere is frequent. He is a catalytic presence, not an irreplaceable hand. A cult dies when the leader coughs. A system stutters and then resumes. SpaceX and Tesla have coughed in public often enough that the recovery is the news. The factory learned to carry its weight. The launch team learned to carry its ache. That resilience is the real moat. Money is a moat until it evaporates in a three-quarter drought. Culture is a moat until an acquisition sours it. Process is a moat that gets deeper the more times it is tested. Do not underestimate how alone that makes him look on the rankings you cannot print. Arnault can buy beauty and fidelity to heritage, but he cannot buy the relief that spreads through an engineering bullpen when an integer finally behaves. Buffett can buy legal control of an insurer that will outlast all of us, but he cannot buy the millisecond shaved from a cycle due to a jig moved half a meter left. Gates can fund a vaccine program that rescues lives that statistics conceal, but he cannot fund the feeling in the turbo machinery group when resonance dies. Bezos can buy whole air fleets and lease compute to governments, but he cannot buy the salt in a welder's handshake at sunrise after a third shift that finally met tact. Zuckerberg can buy the rights to a headset future, but he cannot buy gravity's grudging respect. Ellison can buy islands and hospital IT, but he cannot buy free Delta V. Musk doesn't buy these things. He goes where they are earned. That is why he will die with enemies as numerous as his acolytes. He insults fields by accelerating them. He breaks unions of complacency that were formed in good faith to protect against the last century's harms. He delights trolls by being trollable. He disappoints purists by not having only one cause. He disgusts aristocrats by refusing to acquire manners at the rate he acquires factories. He confuses journalists because he is simultaneously what his fans dream and what his critics fear, sometimes inside a single hour online. And yet the same critics will book seats on flights flown over by boosters that came home to the same decks, and their children will borrow cars that drift silently through neighborhoods, electrified in part by grid effects. Tesla helped normalize, and their parents will check in with them on satellite pipes that do not ask permission from a local monopoly. He will be an irritant and an environment. You can choose whether to scratch, not whether to breathe. Consider the scene that most clearly stitches his domains together. A launch day in South Texas, when a gigantic stainless steel tower, an absurd monument to the idea that one day we will have destinations grand enough to deserve it, stares down a wind that smells of salt and engine cleaning. Trucks move in lines that pretend to be parades. The chatter on the channels is almost cheerful, because that is how professionals behave when the odds are not with them. On some other continent, a factory pours aluminum into molds with the patience of a Buddhist, a precision that does not look like excitement until you realize that every calm pour is 1,000 more cars without a defect. In orbit, a web of obedient machines listens without ears. On a freeway, a commuter who once mocked the idea of electric cars checks a rear camera and wonders why the exhaust that once comforted him had always been a form of self-consolation. None of this is victory. It is just Tuesday. That is what it means to move the baseline. Triumph becomes boring. Boring becomes the new altitude. The head-to-head comparisons that pundits love to stage, Musk versus Bezos, Musk versus Gates, Musk versus Buffett, Musk versus Arnault, Musk versus Zuckerberg, Musk versus Ellison mistake swordplay for siegecraft. Yes, you can score the duel by market cap, EBIT, ROE, DAUs, GMV, ARR, brand equity. Yes, on any given day, 2 or 3 of them will outshine Musk on metrics that light up screens in green. But siegecraft is whether your stones reach the wall and whether your wall survives the stones. Musk's stones are iterations. His wall is integration. Bezos is perhaps his closest parallel in this respect. Both are integration maximalists, but their styles diverge. Bezos is a connoisseur of the invisible system. Musk is an exhibitionist of the visible test. Bezos moves so that you almost can't see him move. Musk moves so that you cannot look away. The marketplace needs both kinds of pressure. The frontier favors the one who is willing to let you watch him bleed. There is a temptation, watching him, to believe he is possessed. The center assumption is that he is simply stubborn in a particularly expensive way. He insists on seeing with his own eyes the thing that most executives have learned to delegate into abstraction. Where a normal leader will accept a dashboard, he will go to the station and ask a question that makes the station chief briefly hate him and then later, privately, thank him. Where a normal leader will tolerate a buffer, he will ask why the buffer exists and whether courage could replace it. Where a normal leader will talk of culture in a way that sounds like a brochure, he will use the word pain and mean it. Musk's schools are not off-sites. There are nights where he forbids himself a bed. He will get things wrong because of this. He will make a fetish of speed and pay for it. He will underestimate the stubbornness of a regulation that exists because someone died. He will believe too much in software's power to tidy up a misbehaving physical world. He will promise dates that were born in a brain that takes optimism and testosterone in equal doses. But notice, when the world corrects him, we see it because he is still there. He does not flounce off in a rage to someplace where applause is mandatory. He stays where sarcasm can find him. That is not nobility, it is addiction, and the drug is outcomes. When the future historians of industry compile their ledgers, they will struggle to classify him. He does not fit the robber baron archetype, because he tends to create the very categories he then inhabits. He does not fit the pure technologist, because his work must suffer commerce in order to multiply. He does not fit the merchant king, because his markets are created by feats of engineering rather than taste or financing. He is closest to that older species of industrialist whose biographies smell of oil and powder, who sign letters to their children with the same hand that signed payroll for men who died on their watch, whose monuments were bridges and shipyards and telephone exchanges and dams. But even that is wrong, because he has grafted software's metabolism onto metal's bones. He is an anachronism in both directions. There will come a day when one of his ventures stutters long enough that rivals declare the era over. It is the nature of eras to be pronounced dead prematurely. The test for whether no one can surpass him remains fair will not be whether he avoids the stutter. It will be whether anyone else steps into as many hard rooms at once with the same insistence on public iteration and private accountability. It will be whether another billionaire decides to spend their aura on entropy instead of acquisition, on density instead of diffusion, on heat instead of heat maps. It will be whether another person with capital sufficient to buy yachts decides instead to buy mistakes on camera. Until then, the answer to why Musk sits alone on certain ledgers is as boring as a machining spec. He reduced tolerances on the distance between intention and metal. He recruited an army that enjoys being tired for the right reason. He courted ridicule like a collectible. He made enemies whose arguments are often right and still lose to the sum of his receipts. He strangled excuses by removing options. He synchronized stacks that hate being synchronized. He treated time as the only truly scarce commodity and then spent it like a lunatic. He did not trust the romance of the story. He trusted the burn-in of the chip and the discoloration of a pipe that leaks. He turned impossible into a quality issue. And in the original clip, the one you can still find and play for a child to see their species learning to be a little less ground-bound, there is a moment after the landing where the camera shakes. It is a human hand that cannot help itself. The operator tries to hold the frame and fails because the body knows that it has been present for a thing it will never see with fresh eyes again. That little tremor is why comparisons feel redundant. Put Musk anywhere in the lineup and the scale breaks because it is not designed to weigh that kind of movement. You could build a scale that island. It will measure the difference between two Tuesdays 5 years apart. It will measure how far the default slid. Say, for the sake of argument, that money made a comeback as the universal metric, and that Arnault's cachet or Bezos' cash flows or Gates' portfolios once again put them above Musk on a given list. It would not change the ranking that matters, because that ranking is not updated quarterly. It is updated when the species discovers that it can do something it had previously assigned to myth or to the future that always remains just out of reach. There are only a handful of such updates in a century. He has orchestrated more than one. To surpass him, you will need to stack those updates tighter and higher than comfort allows. You will need to risk dignity on the altar of iteration. You will need to be willing to lose the argument in the comments and win the argument on the pad. The rest is commentary and complaints and sometimes legitimate grief at the way a man can bend so hard toward outcomes that he forgets the softness that outcomes are meant to serve. It is fair to ask whether a civilization that runs on rockets and robots should be led by people who joke like teenagers and fight like pirates. It is fair to ask whether speed is a virtue when human beings must keep up. It is fair to ask whether the sky is improved by a net of machines. Musk does not answer these questions in words. He answers them with an armature of metal and code and factories that are half cathedral, half stomach. He answers them with a bet that if we can do more, we can be more, and that more is a shape we do not yet know, because the constraints have lied to us for so long that we forgot to check their locks. He checks locks. He breaks some. He replaces some with better locks. He hands the key to the machine that replaces him. That is how immortality works when you are allergic to statues.